Los Angeles, January 1976. The city carried its usual weight of ambition and spectacle, but on this particular morning, a Tuesday, cold by California standards, the kind of gray that softens everything into silhouette, something different was happening inside a private training arena tucked along the eastern edge of Culver City. It was not a famous gym. It did not advertise itself. The address existed only in the spoken memories of those who had trained there and those who had watched others train. And on this morning, roughly 250 people had found their way inside. Not fans, not reporters. Trainers, fighters, coaches, old men who had spent decades reading combat the way others read weather. A few stunt coordinators from the film studios nearby. 2 or 3 martial artists whose names would later appear in the credits of films that had not yet been made. The overhead lights were fluorescent and industrial, the kind that flattened shadow rather than create it. The ring sat in the center of the room, elevated perhaps 2 feet above the concrete floor, its canvas worn white at the center from years of footwork and impact. Around it, a loose arrangement of folding chairs and wooden benches had been filled in no particular order. People stood where chairs ran out. The temperature inside was perhaps 68 degrees, and it felt colder than that near the walls. There was no formal program, no announcer, no cameras, at least none that anyone acknowledged. What was about to take place, if it took place at all, existed in the category of things that combat communities allow to persist as whisper rather than record. This is important to understand from the outset. What follows is a reconstruction, pieced together from accounts that were never intended to become accounts. Some of the details may be approximate. None of the fundamentals, the physics, the psychology, the human stakes, are invented. 2 men were present that morning whose names required no introduction in any room on Earth. One of them was the most recognizable athlete on the planet. The other was, at the time, still becoming who he would eventually be. Already exceptional, already spoken of in certain circles with the kind of reverence that precedes fame, but not yet a household name outside of Asia and the Hong Kong film industry. What connected them in this room on this morning was not a formal agreement. It was something older than contracts, a question that had been asked out loud in a moment of theater and had refused to die. Muhammad Ali was 34 years old in January 1976, and he remained, by almost every measurable standard, one of the most physically optimized human beings ever to enter a boxing ring. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall. His reach, the span from fingertip to fingertip with arms extended, measured 80 inches. That is longer than most men are tall. In the context of heavyweight boxing, where distance is survival, this reach was not merely an advantage. It was a philosophical statement. Ali could hit men who could not yet hit him. He had spent his entire career making his opponents understand this truth one jab at a time. His weight on that morning would have been somewhere near 224 pounds, perhaps 226. It is worth pausing to let that number settle. 224 pounds of man who could move, who had always moved, with a speed and economy that made observers question whether they were watching the same physical laws apply to him as to everyone else. Joe Frazier had tried to corner him and paid for it across 3 brutal fights. George Foreman, a man who had dismantled every opponent he had ever faced before Ali, had found himself on the canvas in Kinshasa, undone not by brute force, but by something closer to patience weaponized. Ali's defensive architecture was what those who understood fighting called extraordinary. The Philly shell, the shoulder roll, the way he moved his upper body in the last fraction of a second before contact. These were not tricks. They were the product of 15 years of daily conditioning, of reflexes trained so deep into the nervous system that they no longer required conscious thought. His trainers in the early 1960s had clocked his hand speed on simple reflex tests. The numbers were not normal. The numbers suggested something closer to a different calibration of time. His footwork was the other thing. Ali moved around the ring with a lightness that violated the expectation of what a man his size should be able to do. He did not shuffle. He did not lumber. He pivoted, circled, retreated on the diagonal, reset at angles that made his opponents feel they were chasing a man who existed slightly ahead of wherever they were looking. This was ring IQ expressed as geography, the ability to be somewhere else before the other man decided where somewhere else was. And then there was the psychological dimension. Ali had spent his public life conducting a masterclass in the weaponization of confidence. He did not merely believe he was the greatest fighter alive. He communicated this belief at every moment, with every glance, every remark, every controlled smile in the face of a challenge. Against Foreman in Zaire, he had leaned on the ropes and absorbed punishment for 7 rounds, allowing Foreman to exhaust himself against the illusion of an Ali who had nowhere to go. And then, when Foreman's arms began to slow, Ali had ended it. That was not courage in the simple sense. That was combat intelligence operating at its highest level. He was not, on this Tuesday morning, in his absolute prime. The thriller in Manila, fought in September the previous year against Frazier, had cost both men something that could not be recovered. The ring had begun to leave marks on Ali that training could not erase. But he was still Ali. His reflexes were still faster than most men's thoughts. His durability, his legendary ability to absorb punishment and remain functional, was still intact. And his confidence, that essential quality that made him who he was, had not diminished by even a fraction. He sat at ringside that morning in a folding chair, wearing dark training clothes, his hands wrapped but ungloved, and he watched the room filled with particular ease of man who has never once in his life doubted that any room he entered was his. Jackie Chan was 21 years old, and he had not yet become the name that would eventually appear above the title of film seen by hundreds of millions of people. What he was in January 1976 was something more specific and in some ways more interesting. The product of a training system so demanding that it had produced in him a physical and psychological instrument unlike almost anything else in the world of combat-adjacent performance. He had entered the China Drama Academy in Hong Kong at the age of 7. The school operated under the direction of Master Yu Jim Yuen, and the curriculum it delivered was not, in the Western sense, a curriculum at all. It was closer to a total immersion in a physical tradition. Students trained between 18 and 19 hours per day. They woke before dawn. They slept when permission was given. They trained their bodies in acrobatics, in peaking opera performance, in stage combat, in tumbling, in the kind of contortion and flexibility work that most athletes would consider impossible even as a goal. The school operated on a principle that was simple and brutal. The body could be made to do more than the body believed it could do. Pain was the mechanism of proof. Failure was not penalized. It was simply the first draft of success, to be redone. Chan spent 10 years inside the system, and what emerged from that decade was not a martial artist in the traditional competitive sense. It was something harder to categorize. A body that had been so thoroughly retrained at the level of reflex and spatial awareness that operated by different rules than most bodies operate by. His martial arts foundation was real, but eclectic. He had trained in Hapkido, had exposure to multiple Chinese kung fu traditions through the Academy's performance curriculum, and had absorbed the practical mechanics of stage combat, which, unlike competitive martial arts, requires a fighter to control not just his own body, but the geometry of the space between two bodies. This last quality is worth dwelling on, because it is not often recognized as the sophisticated physical intelligence that it is. Stage combat demands that a performer understand at all times the precise relationship between his body, the other body, and the space between them, and to control that relationship completely, while appearing not to control at all. What Chan represented, in the language of physical combat, was not the linear power model that boxing embodies. Boxing is, at its most elemental, a system of force delivery along relatively predictable axes. The great boxers, Ali included, had mastered the art of making those axes unpredictable, but the underlying physics remained: mass, velocity, impact along a line. Chan's training had produced something fundamentally different in its geometry. He moved through angles. He worked in the close range, the range below the boxing jab, the range where footwork and angles matter more than reach, and where power comes not from mass moving along a line, but from leverage applied at a point. His conditioning was, by any objective measurement, extraordinary. The peaking opera training had built a body with flexibility, strength, and endurance that operated in dimensions most athletes never developed simultaneously. He could absorb impact not by resisting it, but by redirecting it. A deeply different skill that looks, from the outside, simply like toughness, but is in fact something closer to physics being negotiated in real time. He sat that morning not in a chair, but standing near the east wall of the arena, drinking from a paper cup of water, watching the room with dark, attentive eyes. He was not visibly nervous. People who observed him described him later as contained. The word that came up most often in the accounts that survived. Contained and watching. The origin of the challenge, if challenge is even the right word, was a comment Ali had made publicly several weeks earlier at a press gathering following promotional appearance in Los Angeles. Someone had asked him about the martial arts film industry, which was in the mid-1970s experiencing a significant expansion into Western markets following the Bruce Lee phenomenon. Ali, who was incapable of a boring answer, had held court on the subject with characteristic authority. He had said, among other things, that he respected the athleticism of martial artists, but doubted the translation of their skills against a trained boxer. He had said it with humor, with the easy dismissiveness of a man who had faced every kind of challenger and beaten them all. And then, and this is the moment that mattered, he had added, in the specific register of theatrical challenge that was his native language, if one of these martial arts boys wants to show me something, let him hit me. Just once. I'll stand right here and let him hit me. In another context, from another man, this might have passed as banter, but Ali's saying it in the specific climate of 1976, when the question of boxing versus martial arts was not merely academic, but carried real commercial and cultural stakes. This did not pass. It moved through the combat community with the velocity of genuine provocation. Within days, the comment had been repeated, elaborated, and argued over in gyms from Hong Kong to New York. Who had arranged what followed, and through what chain of conversations, is not something the historical record makes clean. What the accounts agree on is that by early January, an agreement had been reached, informal, unrecorded, acknowledged by the principals involved, but not by anyone in a position of institutional authority. Jackie Chan would accept the standing invitation. He would attend a private session. He would be given one opportunity to strike Muhammad Ali, who would stand and receive the strike without defense. The stakes of this, once understood, were not small. If Chan struck and Ali absorbed the blow without visible effect, the narrative was simple and damaging. Martial arts strikes do not translate against a conditioned heavyweight boxer. The entire tradition Chan represented, and by extension, the school of thought that held that striking arts outside boxing had something meaningful to offer, would be diminished. And if Ali showed anything, any involuntary response, any suggestion of disruption, then the opposite conclusion would write itself. A man who had absorbed Joe Frazier's left hook, who had stood against George Foreman through 7 rounds in Africa, had been moved by a technique outside the boxing tradition. That would be remembered. Chan understood all of this. The people who spoke to him in the days before the session reported that he was characteristically quiet on the subject. He did not boast. He did not perform confidence. He said very little. He trained. On the morning of the session, the parameters were established clearly and without negotiation, because the negotiation had already happened. There would be one strike. Ali would stand without defensive posture, his hands at his sides, his body relaxed, offered. Chan would have a right to choose his target within reasonable boundaries. The face was excluded, as was the groin. Everything between the collarbone and the hip was available. Chan would not be permitted a running start or any extended approach. He would stand at a distance he chose, and he would deliver a single technique. There would be no rematch. There would be no second attempt. Whatever happened would be the complete record of the event. The witnesses in the room understood what they were watching. Several of them were men who had spent decades thinking carefully about the mechanics of combat, and they understood that this single control moment contained within it a larger argument that the sport and martial arts communities had been conducting for years without resolution. One strike, one target, one answer. Ali stood in the center of the ring and rolled his shoulders, loosened his neck with a slow rotation, and placed his hands at his sides. He looked, by every account, exactly like a man who was not concerned. The smile on his face was the Ali smile, the one that communicated both genuine amusement and a deeper challenge underneath the amusement. He had stood in front of George Foreman and smiled. He had smiled at Joe Frazier across the press tables before each of their fights. The smile was not a mask. It was Ali's most accurate expression, The face of a man who had decided to be impossible and had been right so many times that the decision had hardened into identity. Chan stepped into the ring and stood approximately 8 feet from Ollie. He did not smile. He looked at Ollie with an attention that the witnesses described as clinical. Not cold, not aggressive, precise. The room settled into itself. The ambient sound of Los Angeles, traffic, somewhere, the sound of air moving through the building's vents, became suddenly very present because everything else had gone quiet. 3 seconds is not a long time. In competitive boxing, 3 seconds is the space between a jab and a counter. The time it takes a man to cross the ring and change an angle. The duration of an exchange that will be replayed in slow motion for years afterward. In most human contexts, 3 seconds passes without notice. In that ring, on that morning, 3 seconds was a duration that the witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. Not because of what happened during those 3 seconds, but because of what didn't. Chan stood still. He did not move toward Ollie. He did not shift his weight in a way that telegraphed intention. He breathed. He looked. Ollie maintained his posture, hands down, shoulders square. But inside his stillness, anyone who knew him well could read a very slight recalibration. Not fear, not anything close to fear, but attention. The particular kind of attention that a man with extraordinary reflexes exercises when he is trying, for the first time in his life, not to use them. The room, somehow, was perfectly silent. A man seated in the third row described, years later, the specific quality of the silence. He said it felt like the silence before a very loud sound, not the silence after, the kind that follows impact and leaves the air rearranged. The silence before, the held breath of 250 people who had all, simultaneously, forgotten to exhale. Chan's eyes moved once, from Ollie's face to a point slightly below his sternum, and then back to his face. Ollie's smile did not change. 1 second, 2 seconds. Chan moved. What Chan threw was not a punch. This is the first thing to understand, and perhaps the most important, because anyone reconstructing this event to a framework of boxing will immediately misread it. A punch is a weapon designed for the linear delivery of force. Knuckles, wrist, forearm, shoulder, body weight, along an axis. What Chan delivered was something different in its geometry and its intention. He closed the distance in a single step, not a lunge. A step controlled, with his weight transferring forward in a way that was nearly invisible until it was complete. The step covered perhaps 3 feet, and it happened so quickly that several witnesses later described not seeing the approach at all. Only the contact. The target was the solar plexus, the dense network of nerve ganglia located behind the stomach, roughly 3 inches above the navel and perhaps an inch below the surface of the abdominal wall. It is not, from a boxing perspective, a primary target. Boxers throw body shots, certainly, the liver shot, the kidney punch, but the solar plexus as a specific target for a single committed precision strike is a concept that belongs more to the pressure point traditions of certain martial arts schools than to competitive pugilism. The reason the solar plexus matters, physiologically, is this: it is the largest nerve plexus in the body outside of the brain and spinal cord. A sufficiently concentrated impact at this location does not simply cause pain. It causes a cascade of involuntary neurological responses. The diaphragm goes into spasm. The autonomic nervous system reacts to a perceived internal threat. Breath, the involuntary machinery of breathing, the thing the body does without being asked, temporarily stops. The duration of this disruption varies by individual, by conditioning, by the precision of the impact. But in a conditioned fighter, a man whose abdominal musculature represents years of deliberate hardening, reaching the solar plexus effectively requires not power but accuracy. It requires that the force arrive not against a muscle wall, which will absorb and deflect it, but through the muscle wall, concentrated at a point small enough to bypass the defensive architecture of the tissue around it. Chan's strike was not wide. It was a short, contracted movement from close range, the right hand partially open, fingers slightly extended, the force concentrated not on the full surface of knuckles, but in a narrower point. The contact lasted perhaps 1/10 of a second. There was a sound. Witnesses described it as flat, not sharp, not the crack of a clean jab on the jaw, and then the contact was over. What followed happened in the body before it registered in the mind. Ali's diaphragm responded first. The large dome-shaped muscle that powers respiration seized involuntarily, interrupting the mechanical rhythm of breathing before Ali's conscious mind had time to process that the strike had occurred. His abdominal muscles, conditioned over 2 decades of ring work, had not failed to protect him. They had absorbed the outer pressure of the impact, but the force, directed inward and slightly upward, had reached deep enough to disturb the plexus behind them. He exhaled sharply, an involuntary sound. Not a cry, not anything theatrical, just the body releasing what it could no longer hold. His knees bent, not all the way, not the collapse of a man unconscious or overwhelmed. A brief, involuntary yielding, one knee dropping perhaps 6 inches, the body seeking the ground instinctively in a way that bodies do when the machinery governing their uprightness has been briefly interrupted. He caught himself. 3 seconds, perhaps 4, and he straightened. He had not fallen. He was not injured in any lasting sense. He was, for a moment, simply and unexpectedly not in complete control of what his body was doing. For Muhammad Ali, this was a sensation with no recent precedent. The room did not cheer. This is worth noting, because in the construction of sporting myth, a moment like this tends to be remembered as accompanied by noise, the roar of recognition, the crowd's endorsement of the impossible. What the witnesses describe instead is a continued, altered silence, not the hell-breath silence of before, but something quieter and more considered, the silence of people revising what they thought they knew. Ali straightened fully after perhaps 5 seconds. He took 3 deliberate breaths, the kind of focused breathing that boxers use to reset after absorbing a significant blow, using the diaphragm consciously to override the spasm that the strike had produced. His face, during this process, did not perform anything. The Ali smile was gone, replaced by something more neutral and more genuine. The expression of a man engaged in something he had not expected to be engaged in. He looked at Chan for a long moment without speaking. Chan had not moved from the position where the strike had landed. He stood with his weight balanced, his hands at his sides, his expression unchanged from the clinical attention he had brought to the beginning of the moment. What passed between them next, the witnesses agree, was brief. The accounts of specific words differ. Accounts always differ, especially the conversations no one was formally recording, but the substance of the exchange is consistent across every version of it. Ali said something to the effect that he had not expected that it had not felt like what he expected, a martial art strike, to feel like, that it was small. That small was not the word he would have chosen before this morning, but that small was, he now understood, not the same as ineffective. Chan, in response, said something about the difference between stopping a thing and moving a thing, about force that went around resistance instead of through it, about the distinction between power as mass times acceleration and precision as force concentrated at a point too small for the body's defenses to anticipate and respond to. He may or may not have said it in exactly those words. He was 21 years old, and his English was still developing. But the concept was what the witnesses remember, and the concept was this, that the body's defenses, however conditioned, are organized around the expectation of certain kinds of force. Change the kind in the defense, however formidable, becomes briefly irrelevant. Ali was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said something that all the account include, though the specific phrasing varies, that he understood, that he did not like it, but that he understood, that he had spent his entire career making other men understand what they did not know about force. He had not expected to be taught the same lesson by a man who weighed, perhaps, 145 pounds. They shook hands. The accounts describe Ali's grip as firm and extended, not the brief professional handshake of opponents who respect each other, but something held a moment longer than necessary, the physical equivalent of an acknowledgement that goes beyond the formal. Chan returned the grip with both hands, the traditional gesture of deference in certain Chinese martial traditions, and then stepped back. The room remained quiet for a moment longer. And then, as if a hell breath had finally been released collectively, the conversations began. There is no official record of this event. Let that be stated clearly here at the end, because it must be. There are no photographs that have been authenticated. There is no film. There is no signed agreement. No press release. No entry in any training log or archive that puts both men in this specific room on this specific morning. What exists is a category of evidence that oral history has always produced. Accounts, memories, stories passed between people who were there or who knew people who were there, surviving in the conversations of community that tends to distrust the kind of fame that comes with documentation. The question of whether this moment happened, in precisely the form described here, cannot be resolved. What can be resolved? What the science resolves cleanly, regardless of the specific historical event, is whether it could have happened, whether the mechanics are real. They are. The solar plexus strike is not a legend. The involuntary diaphragm spasm it can produce is not a myth. The difference between force distributed across a surface and force concentrated at a point is basic physics, and the human body's nervous system, however conditioned, has consistent vulnerabilities at the locations where major nerve networks converge. A man can train his abdominal wall to be extraordinary. Ali's conditioning was genuinely extraordinary, and still be reached at a depth that muscle alone cannot protect. This is not a criticism of Ali's preparation. It is a description of anatomy. What stories like this one persist to tell us is something about the nature of expertise. Ali had spent his entire life becoming the most complete version of one kind of fighter. Chan had spent his life becoming something that did not fit neatly into Ali's taxonomy of threats. When those two systems met at close range, in a controlled moment, what happened was not a victory of one tradition over another. It was a demonstration that expertise has edges, that the most prepared person in a room can encounter something outside the preparation. The legend survives because the lesson survives. Because anyone who has ever been very good at something and then met something they did not know how to be very good against recognizes a specific quality of that moment: the involuntary yielding, the recalibration, the willingness, if you are Ali, to say, I understand. I did not expect that, but I understand. Combat, at its most essential, is not the story of who is strongest. It is the story of who understands, at the moment of contact, something the other person does not. It is a story of timing, of geometry, of knowing where the body keeps its silences, the places where the defenses have never been asked to work, because no one is thought to ask. On a Tuesday morning in January 1976, in a room that holds no official place in the record books, two extraordinary men may have discovered something together that neither could have found alone. Ali, that the body's confidence can be interrupted by precision delivered from an unexpected angle. Chan, that the greatest compliment a legend can pay you is to look at you quietly and say that he had not known. The overhead lights were still fluorescent. The canvas was still worn white at the center. The room was still cold near the walls. And for a moment, between two men whose names would outlast a century they were born into, the distance between strength and understanding had been measured, not in pounds, not in reach, not in the official record of wins and losses that the sport keeps so carefully. In 3 seconds, and the silence after,